So Dan and I have done a handful of these webinars where we kind of co-present, and I'll do some of my images and he'll do some of his. And I really like that format, that little bit of interplay. And what I wanted to do was, the reason actually, or the catalyst for this webinar was Dan went shooting, in December, I think, and to Silver Falls in Oregon, and has these beautiful, beautiful black and white prints that he has hanging on his wall here in the On1 headquarters. And I love them. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool to just do a black and white webinar? I'll do a few of my images. He can do a few of his. We kind of attack it different ways. But it will give everyone kind of an idea of the different, black and white. I think black and white in and of itself is a pretty binary term, black and white. But in reality, there's a lot to black and white that I think people overlook. And for me, to me personally, this is just an opinion. I think someone like Vincent Versace would agree. The action of going to the develop module over here and just dragging the saturation slider in Lightroom, for instance, here, that's not really what I would consider black and white. It does the job in terms of removing the color from all of the channels. But really, there's so much more that you can do to explore black and white. Now, a little history, for me at least, what black and white means to me. For the longest time, especially over the past 4 or 5 years, I spend all my time and my energy as a photographer focusing on HDR, or high dynamic range photography. And namely, that was more for getting all of that really delicious tone, all the details in the highlights, all the details in the midtones, and all the details in the shadows. And it's a lot to give the viewer. You do that for some years and you start to realize, well, you know what, there's something else to this. And so I wanted to explore more shape and form. And I do that primarily by removing the whole color channel and focusing on the kind of low dynamic range shape. And so with this image here, let's start with this image. I have 2 images, and I think Dan has 2 images. These are both the 2 images I'm working on were taken on Staten Island. I've been posting a lot of shots from this beach here that my parents live near. And yeah, Phil's asking, was this taken with a slow shutter speed? Yes, it was. If we go to the EXIF really quickly to get the photo information, if we scroll down here in Lightroom, it was a 45-second exposure. The aperture was f11, and it was shot with my Fuji X100. The camera was on a tripod. The X100 has a little thread on the front of it to put filters, and so I had a Lee Big Stopper 10-stop neutral density filter. So in the broad daylight, I was able to drag the shutter for 45 seconds, and the byproduct is beautiful glassiness in the water, and you get motion in the clouds. So what I can do here is use black and white and remove the distraction, as it were, of color. So let's go ahead, and in this situation, I'm actually going to start in Photoshop. Just for a quick reason, I'll show you that right now. I'm going to go to Photo, and then Edit In, and send it to Photoshop. Now, the entire suite is accessible through Photoshop. So let me just go here and go to, where's that? Oh, the application frame, just so we remove the distractions of the background. I don't want Lightroom in the background here. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is, every product is accessible, like I said, through Photoshop, and typically my workflow, I'll be using the suite as the hub to get to the products. But yes, George is asking if these tools will work the same way in standalone. They will, absolutely. But the reason why I'm using, for instance, the tools here in Photoshop is I really like their content-aware fill. And this pylon over here, there was a second one right on camera right, and it was, as you can see, the sun was up here somewhere, and it cast a shadow, and to me this is distracting. So I'm just going to take a stab at this and make a selection using the selection tool. I'm going to go kind of around the shadow and let it complete itself, and then I'm going to go to Edit, Fill, and then under the Use, I'm going to make sure Content Aware is set, and this is hit or miss. It can either work. Okay, so this works for me, and I can fix this right here pretty easily. All I'm going to do is take my clone stamp right here. Whenever you have a heavy textured pattern like this, it's easy to kind of clone it out, and so you can see how maybe able to really easily just kind of fill this information in. So that was a pretty easy way to get rid of that shadow. Now it looks clean. From here, I'm going to actually go to Perfect Effects right from within Photoshop. Now you can do that two ways. The first way is using the On-One panel, which you see here. And if you don't know how to get to it, let's say you have Photoshop and you want to access our stuff, you go to Window, Extensions, and then select On-One. That'll pop the panel up, and you can position it. You can have it free-floating, or you can dock it into one of the other panels that you've got. The other way that you can access the product is by going to File, Automate, and then our products are listed over here. So one of two ways. Not to kind of convolute things, for me, the main reason why I'd want to go here is if I wanted to record an action from Photoshop. You'd want to, let's say you wanted to record an action that applies a certain black and white effect. If you record the action and go into Perfect Effects through the panel, it won't work just because of the way Photoshop works. So with that, let's go ahead and launch Perfect Effects. I'm going to go and double click on Perfect Effects here, and that will launch the product. Now, there are two ways that you can attack black and white processing with Perfect Effects. Dan, actually, again, my colleague over here, did a wonderful job of building these effects for us. So all these effects and all these categories that you see here, Dan kind of sat there, you know, late nights, long weekends, and built these effects. So it's a great starting point. And they're there for you to use. However, for me personally, one of the best features of Perfect Effects is the ability to build your own effects, as it were. And so I'll show you what I mean by that. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the effect bar altogether, since I'll be building my own effects. And I can do that right here on the bottom right. You can see these three little icons, and these control the image browser. And so to hide the image browser, I can just click on that solid square, and it'll go away. The reason why I like to do that is because it gives me more real estate on my screen. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I want to build my own black and white effect. And if you're new to Perfect Effects, odds are you're in this tab up here on the top right, and it says Basic. With Basic, you don't have access to the building blocks of the effect. And so you will want to click on Advanced, and by doing so, you get the Effect Options pane. With that, if you drop down, you can see all of the building blocks for the effects that Dan builds in Perfect Effects. And I'll start with black and white, which is the category I want. And so you can see here, the image is now rendered in black and white, but we have these sliders to control and refine. For me personally, I like to increase the contrast. I like to have a really contrasty black and white image, and so I'm going to increase that right there. I might do it a little bit more. The next thing that I love to do, and this is, so at the beginning of the webinar when I was talking about processing in black and white, and I said that there's so much more to black and white than just like reducing the saturation to 0. I was referring to the color filter, and I know Dan's a big fan and kind of uses it really effectively, but the color filter simulates what photographers actually used to do by putting color film or a color kind of gel in front of the lens with their black and white film. So you can see, and this is totally experimental, a lot of times the scene dictates what color you'll want to use, but as you adjust the color, certain parts of the image get exposed differently as opposed to others. So you can see I'm just kind of radically sliding the color slider around, looking for something that I like. Now, as I shift towards the right of the color spectrum, I'm kind of losing that contrast and the detail information in the sky, which I want. So I'm going to swing this back more to the left. One second here. There we go. All right, so we're kind of getting there. You can see that, oops, my cursor's snapping too fast. The other thing that I want to do is add a slight tone to the image. And for this, I kind of want to get the slightest bit of a blue tone. And I can do this one of two ways. We actually have some, under the toner dropdown, we have some presets. So we've got the sepia, the blue, selenium, gold, brown, but we also have this custom. So with the custom, on either a Mac or a PC, by selecting it, it'll bring up the respective operating system's color picker. And so here you can see we've got we can choose any tint. And I'm going to go towards the blue, but a very, very faint blue, and I'll hit OK. You can see that the tonal strength, see how it gives it that kind of cool tone to it? And that's what I was going for here. A lot of times I'll let the environment dictate the tonality of the image, and in this case, the wind was blowing the clouds pretty fast. Fast clouds, fast wind, you typically think it's going to be a bit cooler, temperature-wise, both literally when you were standing there and also figuratively in terms of the color temperature of the image. And so what I can do is, you can see with the tonal strength, I can increase that. This is a bit too much. Again, I want it to be pretty faint, but it is still, my black and white image. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Add right here under the effect stack to commit that black and white layer, and then I'm going to build one more effect, and that's going to be my little texture booster. So by going to the effect dropdown and going to Tone Enhancer, I'm going to have these sliders here that allow me to control various attributes of the image, like brightness and contrast, as well as the black point, the highlights, and the shadows. For me, right now, I'm only concerned with the local contrast slider and the clarity slider. And the local contrast slider, actually, let me pause for a quick second. While I'm adjusting these sliders here, the local contrast and the clarity, I'm looking at the image, and I'm really only concerned with the pylon and the concrete slab. I don't care about the water, I don't care about the island, I don't care about the sky. And I'll show you why. I'm going to go ahead and increase the local contrast a bit. And what that's doing is it's adding a little bit of local contrast, and that's a perceived improvement or increase in texture. And I'm also going to do an increase in clarity, which is similar to what you'd find in Lightroom, the clarity slider. Now that I've got my texture kind of looking pretty good, the problem is that these are global adjustments. You can see how it added the entire the clarity and the local contrast to the whole image. And what I'm going to do is go to my masking brush and bring up my inspector. Now, I know I've received a lot of questions about what happened to especially from the Photo Tools users. What happened to the brushes that we used to have in Photo Tools? We had some brushes. We had a paint lighter, paint darker, paint more contrast. In reality, with Perfect Effects, every effect is a brush. Every single effect is a paint and brush, and I'll show you how. I said that the reason why I was only focusing on the pylon and the concrete is because I know that this tone enhancer slider with these custom settings now can be a brush. And to do it, all you do is you bring the masking brush up, just like I did from the tool well, and I brought the inspector up, which is right here, this little letter, lowercase I. And I'm going to press the invert button. The invert button does two things simultaneously. The first thing it does is it hides the effect from the image, so we're back to the image on the black and white layer. But it also changes the painting mode from paint out to paint in. So the combination of hiding everything plus the brush and paint in mode allows me to control exactly where the effect is applied. So you see, you remember I was saying I was only focusing on the concrete slab and the pylon because I wanted the look to be to whatever the desired amount is. I knew that by inverting it, it would hide that harsh effect from the rest of the scene, and I can kind of just use a masking brush right now with my trusty Wacom tablet to paint in that texture. Now you can see I'm going to hit on the Mac, I'm going to hit Command P. On the PC it would be Control P, but you can see the original image and the black and white conversion. So to me, this is much moodier. This is much, much more solemn. This is a nice, cheery, colorful image. It's not the effect or the intent that I was going for. I wanted something that was a bit more stark. I can even adjust it some more by dropping the brightness, but if I did that right now, it would only drop the brightness of the concrete. Actually, to that point, I might bring the brightness up a bit. There we go. So that makes it stand out. I can see that my masking was sloppy right here, so all I need to do is change my painting mode from paint in to paint out, make a tiny brush, and just kind of remove that brightness from the edge. If you're going to play that game of masking like me, you don't want to be sloppy, because sloppiness, it just doesn't resonate well, as it were. So when you're masking, make sure that the edges of whatever you're masking, that your masking brush doesn't break the edges. And actually, I did that a little bit right there. There we go. Now, I'm done with Perfect Effects. I'm going to hit Apply. But actually, before I do, let me just tell you a little cool thing. Let's say, and as was the case this day, I shot a bunch of images. And on my blog recently, I wrote a post about one of the things that I want photographers to try to challenge themselves with this year is to create series, shoot for a series, kind of like Dan did when he went shooting at Silver Falls. Was get a series of images, a collection or a story of images that are kind of mutually exclusive of each other. They're not necessarily the same image of this concrete and the pylon, but they're different aspects of the beach, for instance. And I actually built a series from this called South Beach Solitary. What's my point here? Well, one of the things that I like about series is when there's a consistent processing look. And I can ensure that I get a consistent look to this image by saving this combination of effects as a preset. And to do this, I can go to Preset and then Save Preset. Now, I can call this, concrete slab. And I'll create a new category by going to Add New Category, and I'll call this South Beach Solitary. So, and then I can just put my name here. Create. Now I can take this preset that I created and I can do several things. I can either open up a different image in Effects and apply the preset, or I can do a batch processing from Lightroom with that preset, and it'll apply to all the images. So it's one of those really nice things that you can do. I'll hit apply now that I created my preset here. David, I see your question. Does the preset save masking strokes? That's a very, very good question. The answer is no. So in this event, if I applied the preset, which has the custom masking, what would happen is that tone enhancer would apply to the whole image. So for presets that you, it actually allows me to segue to an interesting point. For presets that have masking in it, you kind of want to be careful in terms of, it's great to share them. Just note that you'll want to remember that you have to go to that layer and mask. So in a batching workflow, it might not work as well. All right, I'm not done though with this image. Let me show you one of the things that I love about the suite, especially Suite 6, and this was a feature that I was begging for a while, especially in the Suite 5 days, was true interoperability. I want these products to play well with each other. And so in this case here, I'm jumping from effects and I'm going to go to focal point. Now there were two primary reasons why I sent this image to Photoshop. The first was what I showed you at the beginning, that content aware fill. But in this situation here, what I also want to do is I want to simulate a shallow depth of field. And I want to only protect the pylon and the concrete. And so I can do this in Photoshop really easily. I'm going to take my quick select brush right there, and I'm just going to start making my selection around the pylon. And you want to be, pretty neat about the pylon, or not the pylon, but the selections that you make, because focal point will respond to that. So you can see here, I'm just kind of tidying this up. I don't mind spending a bit of time here because I want to make this point very clear to all of you. And then the concrete slab should be a bit easier to do. Let's just kind of close that selection up. Oops, don't want that. And I'm just kind of getting this part here. And I'm not as concerned about the edge of the concrete that's closest to the bottom part of the frame, and I'll show you why in a second. All right, so here's my selection. I'm happy with it. It looks good. If I sent this image right now to focal point, so if I sent this as it is with this selection to focal point would only blur the pylon and the concrete, because focal point, when used in tandem with Photoshop, respects any selections that you make. So think about it. Right now, my selections are the pylon and the concrete. If I send it to focal point, I would tell focal point, only blur the pylon and the concrete. Oops. I don't want that. I want focal point to blur everything but the pylon and the concrete. And so I can do that by inverting my selection. So select everything but this. So I'll do that by select, inverse, and now everything but the pylon and the concrete are selected. And I'm free to go to focal point and watch what happens. Let me reset my settings here. And you can see my focus bug. If I put it over the pylon. Notice how the pylon and the concrete, they're always staying in focus. This is good, because watch what it allows me to do. I'm going to change the shape of my bug here from round to planar by selecting it from the shape dropdown, and I'm going to make this more of a horizontal perspective on the foreground. So remember how I said I don't really care about the selection down here? I said that because I knew that this selection would be covering the foreground. And I'm going to make it pretty large. With that done, I'm also going to drop the amount of blur because with focal point, at least in my opinion, a little goes a long way. You really don't need that much blur. But notice now you're getting this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful three-dimensional aspect. The pylon and the concrete are really standing off of the background. I can further kind of accentuate that. I'll bring the highlight bloom only to bring out some of the highlights in the bright part of the horizon. I'm also going to drop the brightness of the out of focus area and boost the contrast. And the last thing I'm going to do is add a slight vignette. I deselected this vignette follows focus bug because if I didn't, the vignetting would kind of follow the edge of the planar bug. And then I'm going to bring the midpoint up. So watch the before and the after. And in focal point, the before and the preview toggle is right here at the bottom with this checkbox. That was our before, and then we were able to have a much more dramatic look after. And so let's hit apply here. And Photoshop crashed. So, you know, at least it was Adobe crashing and not us, but let's pretend that didn't happen. Unfortunately, well, I'm glad you saw the original, but unfortunately we lost our change there. But to illustrate, that's what I wanted to do there using two of the products. Move on to the second one over here. And with this one, I'm just going to go straight into the suite from Lightroom. And I can do that by going to File, Plugin Extras, and selecting the Perfect Photo Suite. So what Lightroom does in the background, if we just jump right back, because I get this question a lot, what Lightroom will do if I go to the grid is it automatically creates a copy of the image and it saves it as a PSD file. So we are really understand the importance of non-destructive workflows, and by working on a copy of your image, you can feel comfortable that your original image is intact. Here we go. Thanks for crashing during my webinar. Cool. All right. Now, with that, I can go back to Perfect Photo Suite. Once I'm in Perfect Photo Suite, what you didn't see when I was in Photoshop was you didn't actually see the hub of Perfect Layers. So here, we sent the image from Lightroom to Perfect Layers or the suite, and I can go to Effects right from the interface. And now we have our interface here again with the black and white effects, but for me personally, I like to build them, no disrespect to Dan, but I just like to have a little bit more control. We give you that control. So now I can go back to the black and white here, and I'm just going to speed things up a bit because I want to give Dan his turn. I'm filibustering a bit too much. So what I'm going to do is, in this situation here, I think 100% contrast works well. And the reason for this is here. Shots like this. So this is the original color shot. Again, this was the same scene, same day. Fuji X100, Lee Big Stopper. Actually, was this the Fuji? No, this was not. This was my Canon. But the point is, I overexposed the image in terms of setting the exposure time for longer than the camera can expose, and it blew out the highlights. When I get this is irrecoverable data. This is pure white. There is no information here. So if you try to drop the brightness, you'd get this really weird artifacting. In these situations, for me personally, black and white is a wonderful alternative because in black and white, that kind of low dynamic range look really, really works well. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start playing around with the color filter until I get it to a look that I like. And as I go here towards the right of the spectrum, I'm liking this because I get more exposure information here through the frame. And notice how when you remove the color information, the ghosting here just looks a little bit more ethereal. So that looks nice. I really like that as well. And in this situation, I'm also going to go to the toner and add a slight gold tone because I want to give it a bit of a vintage look. I'm actually going to drop that tone strength down to about 10, 9 or 10, because I want it to be very, very minimal. Thanks, Andrew. Good to see you back, Andrew. Now what I'm going to do is I want to accentuate this a bit. I don't normally do this, but I think it will work. I'm going to hit add to commit the layer, and I'm going to bring my effects bar back up. And I did that by clicking on the first icon. It looks like a rectangle with 3 little squares. That will restore the hidden effects bar. And I'm going to go to the Textures tab. I know that we have a few textures that do a really nice job of simulating warmth. And so this clean paper effect right here, the texture rather, does a really nice job. So I add it. And let's hide the image bar for a second, or the effects bar rather, to show you what I'm going to do with it. Notice how the texture file, the main texture, the main body of the texture is a little bit smaller in resolution than the image. And so what I want to do is I don't like having this lighter border around the image. I can take my texture and using the scale slider right here, I can stretch it out until the border is covered. So you can see now that we've essentially stretched it out and we have a very, very awesome kind of vintagey look. Like this looks like a photo that you found in a shoebox that your grandfather took. And that's what I was going for. That was my intent for this image. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit add. And just like before, this is something that I do to just about every single image you ever see me post. I go to the effects, and just like with the first image, I go to the tone enhancer. I boost the tone by using a local clarity and a local contrast and clarity boost, and I turned it into a paint in brush. So I'm going to invert it, and the only thing I really care about is painting in this gnarly piece of wood because I want that texture to pop out. I'm also going to let it bleed into the ghosting over here because it adds a little bit of mood. I'm actually going to paint it out right there. I don't like that. There we go. And so here we go. Let's close the inspector, and I'm going to do a Command P. That was our original shot. Good base, if I do say so. But I really like the vintagey look here, especially right over there. I could bring it into focal point if I want, but yeah, I'm going to do that. I can do that straight from effects by clicking on blur. That will commit the changes in Perfect Effects and go straight into focal point. And so here, let's reset everything very quickly, and I'm just going to breeze through this. I'm going to take again a planar bug, and I'm going to put it at more of an angle, kind of down here. Big fat bug. There. Next, I'm going to drop the amount. Again, don't need to have that much blur. Actually, let me tilt it a bit more. There we go. Even like that, like 3. You see what 3 does? It does a perfect job. And I'm going to bring the brightness down. Let's see, up. I like it up. I like it up because it's blowing out some more of the sky in the background. But I'm also going to bring the contrast up. And I'm going to bring the optical quality up. With that, I think let's do the before and the after. Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Let's hit apply. And here we go. Let's do our little walkthrough. Let's turn these layers off. All right. So here is our original image. Then we use Perfect Effects to apply a black and white layer with a gold color tone and a texture. The texture added some body to the sky, and then we added focal point to give it a little bit of shallow depth of field, really bringing the viewer over here, not distracting so much by the skeleton over here of the dead pier. If I hit save, Perfect Photo Suite will update the PSD file, and now if I come back to focal point, or to Lightroom rather, there's my image. And the cool thing is if I send this to Photoshop, let's say there's something I need to do in Photoshop, those layers are going to be intact. You can see on the bottom right here in my layer palette, all 3 layers with their layer titles are intact. So if there's something in particular that you need to do, we support it. So with that, Let me go ahead and I'm going to make Dan presenter, and I'm going to mute myself. While Dan's presenting, I'll be fielding questions. So take it away.
There we go. Hopefully my screen sharing there. Well, thanks, Brian, for having me here today. And I was just going to see if there were any questions that came up that were good ones. I think there was one at the top of the question list about the difference between luminance and luminosity. And I have to admit, to me, I kind of think of the two as the same thing. So I'm not sure if maybe you had a different definition of those. I mean, well, I guess there is kind of a bit of, I mean, technically when you think of luminance, you can almost think of that as like brightness, but luminosity is more like a quality of light. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit more. Well, you can turn your mute back off. No, hope not.
Oh, okay. The difference between luminance and luminosity. I know that for me, I also think of it the same way. I know that luminosity is typically the nomenclature used on the sliders and some of the post-production tools that we use. Luminance, I think, would, if I had to think about it, luminance would be the amount of light in an image, and luminosity would be the quality of light, or the actual the type of. To me, it just seems like two different. I don't know if there's a difference between the two, and it's not like I'm trying to think of things, but I know that there's a luminosity slider, and when I think of luminance, I think about the how much, I guess how much luminosity there is. So while Dan's doing that, I'm actually going to research it and see if I can find something, and if I do, I'll chime in.
Well, that's kind of our good esoteric question of the day.
Actually, before you go on, can you talk? There's a great question that Gerald asked about smart objects, and I know that we support them, but do you want to quickly just jump, like?
Sure, I can talk to that. I'm not going to actually do an example because I'm going to be working straight through Lightroom and Perfect Photo Suite today, but to use any of the tools as a smart object, if you're a Photoshop user, you would just convert the layer that you want to work with into a smart object. And then when you send that smart object to Perfect Effects or Perfect Portrait, it will then be applied as a smart filter. And the cool thing about a smart filter is you can always go back, double click on it. It brings you right back into Perfect Effects or Perfect Portrait. All of the sliders are set exactly where they were, and you can then go back and readjust those. So it's a very flexible, more of an instruction-based, non-destructive way of working. So, and I'm positive that Brian has some great videos on how to do that in the university as well. So. I'm going to start here in Lightroom, and one of the questions that I noticed earlier was, can you use HDR and still do black and white? And of course, that's a great way to work, and even though Brian may have not mentioned it, I mentioned on a lot of his images, those were probably a bracket of multiple images that were put together using HDR software. Yeah, were they? No? They're all single shot? All right, you're finally learning to expose properly. I like that. So, alrighty, well, apparently I can't, so, uh-oh, that's not a good sign. Something's about. Okay, so if you guys check your chat module, there's actually a link where you can go and learn more about the difference between luminance and luminosity, and apparently Brian and I are going to have to read that one too. So here inside of Lightroom, I've actually got two stacks, two different images that we're going to work on today. These are both shot in Silver Falls State Park. And the first one, if I open up this stack, you'll actually see the three images that I used to create my HDR bracket. And even though this was a very overcast day, there's still a little bit of difference. So I kind of shot one that was my normal exposure, shot one that was a little bit lighter so I could get some of these details in the dark lichen on this tree, and I shot one that was really dark just to make sure I held all the highlights up here in the sky. And then I stitched those together with HDR, and we end up with this as kind of our starting point. It's a nice color image, but I think it's going to be a much stronger image when we actually do it in black and white. So I'm just going to select that image, and we'll send it off to the Perfect Photo Suite. And it'll take a second. It's basically taking that, what was a TIFF file in Lightroom, and it's making a copy of it in Photoshop format, and it's going to send it to the suite. And we start off here in perfect layers, like you've seen several times already today. Then I'm just going to click on the Effects tab right up here to send it to Perfect Effects. Now keep in mind, while I'm in here in layers, if there's any other work I want to do in advance, I could do that in here. Like, for example, I noticed that I've got a little squiggly dust bunny that was on my sensor. So I'm just going to grab the retouch tool here inside of layers, and then I'm just going to brush over this little guy to remove that little piece of dust that I saw. So there we go. If there were any other little distractions like that, that's a great tool to use to minimize those. Now, let's click on Effects. There we go. And when we start off in effects, obviously down at the bottom, we happen to start off in that black and white category. And if you're just getting started with Perfect Effects, kind of as Brian mentioned, this is a good place to start exploring some of the built-in presets that you can use. I'm actually going to end up going and doing some custom stuff, kind of like Brian did. But there's one other place that I wanted to mention, that is in the film category. So if you're a film purist, if you go to film, there's actually presets that are created for a lot of different popular black and white films, and they reproduce the tone curve. So basically the visual response of that film, and even the grain. We actually went out and scanned the real grain from all these different film types. So it's actually the actual grain from that film that's being overlaid with them. So they're a pretty faithful reproduction of these different types of black and white films. But for me, I'm just going to go over here to Effect Options. Make sure you're in the Advanced mode, not the Basic mode. That gives you access to all of the effect options down here. And I'm just going to click on Black and White. And that starts me off with basically my own black and white that I can start with. And I'm also going to hide the library down here at the bottom because I don't need it right now. And if I hide it by clicking on the right-hand the farthest right, there's these three little icons, one for the film strip view, which is the default, one that gives you kind of a big matrix view, and then one that will actually minimize it so it's out of the way. You can also use your command down arrow, or if you're in Windows, use your control down arrow, and that'll hide that little strip, so it gives you more real estate to work on. It's also really important if you're using like the brush tool, you want to have as much to work with as possible. So the black and white filter gives you the basic tools you need to make your own custom black and white effect. And as Brian mentioned, the color filter slider is kind of the equivalent of putting a color filter over your lens when you're taking a picture. So if you're an old school black and white photographer like me, you know that putting for example, a green filter over your lens when you're photographing lots of green foliage is going to take all the greens and it's going to make them brighter. It's going to take everything that's the opposite of that and it's going to make them darker. Same thing if you're shooting and you're in the desert and you've got these great looking blue sky. If I use a red filter, it's going to take the blue, the opposite of red, and it's going to make the blue sky much darker and stronger. You kind of got to get that black Ansel Adams looking sky. So anyway, in here, I would just adjust that color filter back and forth. And as you adjust it in real time, you can actually see the different tonal reproduction that you're going to get as different colors in the image become lighter or darker in the black and white representation of the image. So if I move this all the way over here to red, I get kind of this yucky, flat looking black and white. It's not that appealing because this image is mostly green. And if I moved it over to blue, I'm probably going to get a even yuckier looking black and white conversion. So that's why being able to control that black and white conversion is very important. If you just do a simple black and white conversion where it just desaturates the image, it treats each color, all the colors equal, you're going to get, a very kind of flat, homogeneous looking black and white. But watch what happens if I pick the green one instead. So if I come back to that green range, voila, all those cool greens in the image pop out and it actually adds some life to the image. Now, we can go a step further than this if we do a little pre-visualization, if you will. If we kind of know that that's the way it works, if we know that we can pick certain colors and make them lighter or darker, before we do the black and white conversion, if we make those colors even stronger, when we do the black and white conversion, they're going to be even brighter or even darker. So I'm just going to go back in time. You can always go forward and backward in the effect stack. And I'm just going to click on the Add button. We're going to put another empty effect before the black and white effect. And I'm going to use the color enhancer instead. And with a color enhancer, we can affect the color temperature of the image or its saturation, but we can also grab certain color ranges and make them more saturated or lighter or darker. So using the color range pop-up, I'm just going to grab the greens. And then if I grab the saturation and the lightness and I bring those up a little bit, it will take all the really light greens, which are the really fun ones, like these little fern fronds that grow out of the tree and on this central rock, which is a pretty important part. It's going to make those jump up even more. So I'm just going to grab my saturation slider. I'm going to bring that up around 20. I'm going to grab my lightness slider. I'm going to bring that up around 20. Now it's going to look very artificial in the color rendition, but that's not the version we're using. We're kind of just using this as a pre-filter step. So don't be afraid to actually go pretty strong with it. I'm actually going to go way up here to like 35, 40. So it looks like a cartoon here, but now watch what happens when we turn the black and white on. All of those greens are going to become much brighter, and we're going to have a much nicer contrast between the light greens and the rest of the scene. So there we go. So that's one way that you can add a second layer of control to your black and white, is by adding a color pre-filter to it. All right, now I'm going to add another effect layer on top, and I'm going to go to the third tool that I use pretty much all the time. So if you're working on black and white, there's kind of three of these effect options you'd use. You'd use the black and white, you'd use the color enhancer, and you'd probably use the tone enhancer. I'm just going to grab the tone enhancer. And the default settings on the tone enhancer is to use the auto contrast option. That's going to basically take anything at the low end, anything that's really dark, and it's going to make sure there's a real black in it, which is pretty important. If your black and white images lack any true black or true white, they're what we call flat. They lack contrast. They're not very interesting. So watch if I just turn this tone enhancer effect off for a minute. You can see how that looks a little bit flat. It's not as visually appealing. There's no snap or punch to it. So by turning that auto contrast on, it's going to make sure I've got enough real blacks to it. You can always overwrite it using this blacks slider. So the automatic setting turned it up 7. If I wanted to make it a little bit flatter, if I wanted to leave those shadows a little more open, I could bring that down to say 3, or if I want to make them stronger, I could bring them up to like 13 or 14. You can control the black contrast or the black clipping point with that black slider. I'm going to probably go to about 5 or 6 with it. There we go. Just so I have just a touch of black in the scene. And then the other control that I use all the time is this one down here called local contrast. And local contrast is going to boost up the contrast, not on the overall image. When you think about normally, if you were in the dark room and you're increasing contrast, you're going to have to sacrifice highlights or sacrifice shadows to do it. Local contrast doesn't do that. It kind of does it on a microscopic level, and it's going to bring kind of a texture, almost a sharp feeling to the image. It's on 20 right now. I'm going to bring it up to around 30 or 40. There we go. And you can see how that just kind of adds some depth to it. Your eye follows through the image slower because you get more detail and sharpness in this overhanging branch. So that kind of draws your eye first, and then you move to that central rock. All right, I think we're going to do one more step here, and we're just going to add a vignette. So we'll just click on the add button. Now I can go down here and I can add a vignette manually, but I've actually got some nice vignette presets that do the majority of the work for me. So I'm just going to open up the library at the bottom. Let's go to the vignette category, and I'm just going to add the subtle vignette option. It's just going to darken the edges a little bit. And of course you can control how strong it is with that strength slider. I can move it back and forth, control how strong I want my vignette to be. And then usually when I do a vignette, if there's a subject that that needs to break that vignette, you would go ahead and you would use the brush tool or the bug to do it. And in this case, I don't really like the vignette darkening the top of this tree. I mean, this tree on the left is a pretty important part of the image. So we'll just grab the brush tool. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. I'm using the bracket keys on my keyboard. If you're familiar with the keyboard shortcuts that Photoshop uses for changing brush size and brush properties like opacity or feather, those work the same inside of the Perfect Photo Suite. You can always bring up the little inspector, which will tell you more about your brush size and all your brush parameters. And if you're using a Wacom tablet, you can turn on the controls for your Wacom tablet as well. And now I'm just going to paint that vignette out on the top here so that the eye can escape out the top just a little bit. There we go. Let's take a look at our before and our after here. So there's the original color image. And there's our resulting black and white image. And what we did is, if we go back in time in our stack, I'm going to go back to the original. That's where we started. We used a color enhancer to bring up the greens to make them brighter and punchier as a pre-filter test step. Then we added our black and white filter, biased towards the greens. So again, those greens become brighter. We used the tone enhancer to make sure we had some real blacks and to bring up the local contrast or the texture. And then we just added a simple vignette to darken the edges and focus the viewer's eye toward the middle. All right. Any questions on this one before we move on to the next image?
Well, first Phil was asking if you could just do that transition slower one more time, maybe because there might have been a lag.
Sure.
But then the other one, I thought Nelson asked a fantastic question, and actually it would be a question that I would ask. And he asked, is there a good criteria? You're out shooting, so you're out shooting. Is there criteria? Is there something you can think about that would make for making a good black and white image? What would make a good black and white image?
Two good questions. I'll take the easy one first. Let's just walk through the stack of stuff that we did again, so everybody can kind of see that. So I'm going to go back to the original. There's that color image, and then we added a color enhancer. And with that color enhancer, we lightened up the greens and added a little bit more kick to them. Now, I did that manually using the effect options down here. You could also do that just by going to Photo Filters and using an effect called the Green Enhancer. It does pretty much the same thing, wherever the heck Green Enhancer is, right here. You could just add this green enhancing effect, and it'll do the same thing. Then we added a black and white filter on top of that. And again, I went in, I manually adjusted the color filter range, but if you wanted to, if you were in the black and white category, you could use the, where is it? The green filter option right here. That's going to give you very similar results as well. We added a tone enhancer to make sure that the blacks in the image were there, so it wasn't too flat, and to add a little bit of texture. We did that manually, but again, if I was in the color and tone category, I could click on tonal contrast preset right here, and that'll give me a very close results. And then we finished it off just by adding a vignette around the edges, just to darken the edges, and I used the brush tool up here just to brush out the vignette on the upper left-hand corner so that the tree sticks out of the vignette. So it kind of has a little bit more of a dimensional quality to it. So the overall before right there, and then the after right there. Now the second question about, when you go out shooting, knowing whether something is going to make a good black and white or not, it's a bit of a loaded question. I think every image can make a good black and white. It comes down to some pre-visualization in the process. Lighting has a lot to do with black and white, so you're really looking for a scene that has some nice dynamic lighting. If it's a super flat day, it can be difficult to make a really compelling black and white, especially if it's a very monotone image. It might be a little bit difficult, or especially if it's in a color range that your camera may not do a very good job with. If it's an all blue image, blues are difficult for digital cameras, so it may not do as good a job. But things that are green, things that are red, those are much easier to create great looking black and white things from. But I think you can probably get a good looking black and white from any subject matter with a little bit of practice. It really just comes down to the pre-visualization and knowing what you want to do with the tonality is what makes a difference.
I actually just posted just a quick kind of Bruce responded, and I really enjoyed his answer, so I shared it with the group. And just as the classic answer to that question is, subjects or scenes with high contrast are good black and white candidates, and I agree with that a lot. So I typically look for that if it's a flatter image, as Dan was saying. I don't know, you typically add contrast in those situations, and so by having it inherently, you can expose properly for it and take it from there. And then Dan, someone was asking a quick question. I didn't see your XF information, but I guess the source images that this was an exposure blend, was it tone mapped or exposure blended?
I think it's the Fusion. I don't know what they call it.
Oh, right.
I use the Fusion one. I like that one better than the tone map one. The tone mapping, it's so easy to make it look fake.
Right.
I use this fusion option that I don't know what it does, but it looks more natural to me.
And with that point, I think they said your apertures were different. Is that correct? Someone, you show EXIF information, and my audience is gonna see it.
Yeah.
Let's see.
That's the. I think these are the actual three. So I had a 20 seconds at f16, 60 seconds at f22, and 16 seconds at f22.
Okay.
I don't know what I was doing.
But in all actuality, even from 16 to 22, you've got your full the scenes in focus from front to back. So, you know, I wouldn't expect this to be any problem with even if you wanted a tone map. It's more if you're going from 2.8 to 16, that would be a problem with tone mapping. You don't really ever want to bracket with your aperture. You'll bracket with your ISO or predominantly 99% of the time with your shutter speed. So, what's the best black and white technique when people are in images? Well, I think black and white's a good way to go, especially if you want to give someone that kind of more of a angelic, creamy skin texture. Only because you're removing color and you're focusing more on tone. So with that, even infrared's a cool option to go with, which I unfortunately don't have anything prepped for that. But I don't know, Dan, if you want to add to that. Other than that, take off with your second image.
Well, on the portrait story, it really depends on what you want to do with it. When you use that filter slider option, the more you go into the red range instead of the green range, the brighter the skin is going to become. So if you're working with a female and you want this very bright, high-key looking skin, using something more towards the red will do that. But typically for people, if you want to reproduce a natural looking skin tone, you're going to be closer to the greens instead to make those look natural. And if you really want if you're working with an older gentleman and you really want the deep dark skin and the wrinkles to really be predominant, you're kind of trying to think of a good example. If you're familiar with Karsh, some of his work where the skin tones are fairly dark and you can see all the detail in the gentleman. You're going to be in that green, even green starting to go towards blue. You don't want to do all blue. People look awful with more of a blue filter. There's very few cases where the blue actually looks good in a black and white because your digital camera has the hardest time capturing those blues. But anyway, let's move on to the second series that we're going to look at today, which is this one right here. And again, this was a bracket. This happened to be a larger bracket because there was a larger range of exposures that we had to deal with. And I'm not going to review the bracket other than you can see there's one that's really light and that transitions to really dark to make sure I've got everything. And the version that we ended up with looked like this. Here's the kind of the flat original color version of it. And I did some white balance adjustments in Lightroom, and that's about it. That's the image that we're going to send off to the Perfect Photo Suite now. And we're just going to get rid of this previous image here. Here we go. And again, same day, same piece of dust. So for some reason, the little automatic dust reduction thing on my camera died, and I've never got back to get it fixed. So someday. Alrighty, now let's send this off to Perfect Effects. And we're going to start doing basically the same thing we did on the previous image in terms of techniques. The first thing we want to do is bring up those greens. I'm going to use presets this time rather than going in and making manual adjustments to speed things up a little bit. I show you how we can do the same thing. If I go to Photo Filters and we add the Green Enhancer, ta-da, you see how it's popped those greens. That's gone like crazy comic book green. That's okay because we're going to take this and we're going to use it as a pre-filter. No one's ever going to see this crazy looking version of it. Let's go back to fit to screen so we can see the whole thing. We'll add an effect layer. We'll go to the black and white category and we're just going to add the green filter option. There we go. Now that looks nice for the rock up here, but the bottom left-hand corner, if we take a look at the original, doesn't really have a whole lot of green, and it's got these little orange leaves in there. That kind of kills this corner. It just gets very flat and boring. There's not a lot of detail or interest down here. So I'm going to show you how we can actually blend two different versions of black and white conversions together. We're actually going to do that in Perfect Layers. So let me just finish this version, then we'll go back and I'll show you how to mix the two together. So we'll do this one here. I'm just going to apply it. This will go back as a new layer back inside of Perfect Layers. There we go. I'm just going to change the name so I don't forget what it was. I'm going to call this the green version. There we go. I'm going to turn that layer off. I'm going to go back to my original. We'll go back to effects again. And this time, I want to look for a black and white conversion that really makes this bottom left-hand corner look more interesting. So I'm just going to grab the black and white filter. And this time, when we move that little color filter slider around, we're just watching this bottom left corner. We want to make sure we get something that adds a little bit more interest. So we want to try to get one that makes those leaves stand out a little bit. So something more in the red range starts to make those pop up a little bit. Let's bring it all the way over to the other side and see if we can get anything better in terms of showing some detail in there. See, if we went with the blue, we can actually make that corner darker if we wanted to. I'm afraid if we make it too dark, it's probably going to end up drawing attention in a way that we don't want. So I'm actually going to go full red on this, just enough to bring a little bit more interest in the bottom left corner. We'll apply that one as well. There we go. Now I've got another layer. I'm just going to name this the red version. And now we can just, using the masking tools, blend those two guys together. So I'm just going to turn on my green version. That has the majority of the scene that I want. We'll grab the masking brush. I'm going to bring up my inspector, make sure it's set to paint out, which it is. I'm going to bring my brush opacity down a little bit, bring my brush feather up, and my size up just a little bit. And now, as I paint over this, it's going to hide the green version. It's going to reveal the red version where I want. So as I paint through here a little bit, we'll start to bring up. Maybe we'll bring that. Keep painting through here a little bit. You can see how those orange leaves that we were losing before are coming back. So we get a little bit more info on those. There we go. So that gives us a better looking bottom left-hand corner. Now I want to take the combination of both of those and go back into Perfect Effects and finish my work. Now, if I clicked on Perfect Effects right now, I would only be getting the green version. I wouldn't be getting the layer underneath it. What I really want is the results of both of those. So I'm going to go up to the Layer menu, and I'm going to use a command called New Layer from Composite. And what that'll do is it'll create a new layer on top of this, and it's going to take everything that you see on screen, and it's going to squish it into one new layer. So there we go. Now we have a new layer that's the results of those two layers masked together. That's the one we'll send to Perfect Effects now. There we go. I'm going to add a little bit of that tone and contrast boost. So we'll go to Color and Tone. We'll use the tonal contrast option. That adds that little bit of tonality boost, which makes the rock really pop out. I don't like so much what it's done to the background, though. I really like that boost on the rock. So we'll use the brush tool here. I'm going to make it kind of fat, and we're going to use an opacity of maybe about 70%. And I'm just going to brush that effect off the background trees because they get too much info and starts to draw the eye away up there more than we want. So there we go. We'll brush that back down. I'm going to apply this, and then we're going to finish it by adding a little bit of blur in the background. I'm going to kind of make it look like it was shot more with a tilt shift lens, because again, these trees are more distracting than they should be. We really want the focus to be this rock and the water. So I'm just going to apply this here. It'll take a second to cook on it, and then we'll send it off to focal point to blur that background a little bit. There we go. Now we'll just click on the blur module. This will pop focal point up in its own little window. There we go. I'm just going to reset everything so we can start from scratch. There we go. So this is what focal point would normally look like when you start. It has the round focus bug in the middle. I don't really want the round one for this case. I want the square one or the planar one. I'm going to grab the little legs. I'm going to pull and twist to make a plane of focus that kind of runs the angle across the top of the rock, about that same angle. And then I'm just going to slowly move this down until that blur is taking off the top. Now, I have it set at a really high setting right now. I would probably never use it at this strong of a setting, but it makes it easier to see where things are starting to line up at. Then we can come in and grab a lens preset. I'm going to say, oh, this was shot with around a short wide angle, maybe a 35 millimeter. And I'm just going to decrease the overall amount of blur just enough to take the edge off those trees. It doesn't have to be very high, probably 8 or 10. And I'm going to increase the feather. The feather is the transition, how quickly it goes from in focus to out of focus.
And try your sound just dropped. So let's
That's weird. It just popped back in.
That's
there.
weird. It just popped back in there.
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now?
let's see if can you guys hear Dan? Okay. Well, let me mute myself.
And I suppose everybody can still hear me? Yeah. Good. All right. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I'll go back just a second so if people didn't hear what I mentioned. I used the focus brush, made sure it was set to paint focus, and I used a low brush opacity around 40 or 50, and I just painted around the top of this rock. I just want to make sure that all those little light-colored fern fronds that make up this rock are still in focus. And then we'll add a little vignette. Again, you could add a vignette in Perfect Layers, you could add a vignette in Perfect Effects, you could add a vignette in Focal Point. It's such a common tool that we put it in lots of places so that you can use it wherever you need to. So I'm just going to darken those corners ever so slightly. I'm going to make sure the vignette follows focus bug is turned off. That way it creates a vignette that's the same shape as the image. And I can use that midpoint slider to control how tight that vignette is. And I really want it just kind of touching the edges ever so slightly. There we go. I'm going to turn the preview on or off so you can see the before and after the work we did in Focal Point. So there's before and there's after. You can see how it does just enough, taking those trees in the background out of focus so that they become less distracting and keeps your eye on that rock, which is really our center of interest. All right. Brian, any questions?
No. I'm answering one right now offline, but there was one. Oh, Keith asked earlier when you were talking about the film grain, how we scanned it. Do you know if that was? Do we scan it off 35 millimeter or medium format film?
Their scan off.
Their scan off
35.
35.
So it's 35 millimeter film.
Yeah.
Randall's asking where the before and after button is, so if you want to just show that preview button at the bottom.
Yeah, I was using the Command P. If you're on a Windows computer, you can use the Control P keyboard shortcut, and on all the products, that'll always show you the before and the after. But there's also a little toggle right down here in Focal Point where you can toggle that on and off for before and after. Sometimes we get we're so used to using our keyboard shortcuts that obviously you guys don't get to see those when we're doing those. So I apologize for doing that. You can also always do it from, I think, the View menu. Yeah, show hide preview right there, and that'll turn it on and off as well. Alrighty, anything else out there?
I was waiting for this question that Karen brought up about. So what do you do for printing? Where do you send it to print?
Well, I'm blessed that I actually have my own this big Epson 9900. It's a big 44-inch wide inkjet printer, so I do all my printing on my own. Um, if I was going to send black and white out, um, if you're looking for a real honest, clean black and white with no color at all, it's difficult to have that printed through a lot of the online services because they print on a color-based photo paper, and depending on the light that it's viewed under, it's going to have a slight color cast depending on that light, and there's not really a way around it. If you're using a black and white print that's toned, it has a little bit of color, even just a little bit of color. That will neutralize that issue, and you can print on color paper and be pretty safe. But if you want a very neutral black and white, your best bet is to either print it on a good inkjet printer that has a black and white mode, so that it really just prints with the black and gray inks, or to find a lab that actually prints on real black and white paper. And there's a couple of them out there. I've never used any, so I can't really recommend one over another, but you can get pretty much any of the photography magazines and look in the back, and you'll find a few labs that specialize in black and white printing.
Michael literally took the words out of my mouth. So this was when I was back in Boston. There was a local company called Digital Silver Imaging. They're actually who I sent my camera to get converted to infrared. This is a black and white shop. They have these are the guys. I'll put the link in the chat module. I have absolutely no qualms with promoting these guys because I've seen their work physically, and it's absolutely fantastic.